Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And for this video, we're gonna switch things up a little bit. Because while I've discussed at length the burgeoning 80s hardcore punk scene across different parts of the United States, I haven't really delved into what was going on in punk in other parts of the world. And you'd think that since the United Kingdom was one of the main drivers of punk music coming out to the mid to late 70s, they would have a significant hardcore punk presence, at least in the underground at that time. And this is where things inevitably get a little complicated, because in the early 80s in the United Kingdom, punk was in a weird place. Sure, post-punk and new wave were laying the foundation for what would become the second British invasion in the mid to late 80s, and anarcho-punk was curdling in its own artsy far-left corner that I'll admit to being a little bit more familiar with, and honestly I've come to like a lot more, but that didn't mean that hardcore punk didn't have its own unique foothold, but it came from a slightly different source. Oi! Now, I've mentioned the Oi scene before in its adaptation of folk sing-along structures and working-class populism, but by the late 1970s, the genre had gotten co-opted by skinheads and right-leaning white nationalist groups, which tainted the genre and the media discourse, even the critical discourse, for decades to come, despite the protests of some of those original bands. But there was an offshoot of this sound, adapting a distinctive cymbal, snare, bass drum pattern and more blunt lyricism, often going back to the left, which would later lay the groundwork for additional offshoots like crust punk and grindcore and street punk and even crossover thrash to come in later years and even crossover the Atlantic. This was D-Beat, and while bands like the Buzzcocks had sparked some initial interest in the sound, the band for which it was named would break onto the scene after a string of very well-received EPs in the early 1980s, with what one would argue is one of the most influential releases of that time, UK or otherwise. And even if the band would not quite stay in pure hardcore for long, even if they would eventually go back to it, it's important we talk about them all the same. The debut album from Discharge, Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, and this is Resonators. Now, full disclosure, even if I hadn't ventured over to the UK for a couple weeks in August and thought this would be a cute episode to do around that time, I was looking to cover Discharge regardless. While the band didn't exactly stick around initially in hardcore punk, making a glam metal pivot on their second full-length record that infuriated pretty much everybody, they were foundational in laying the groundwork for so many subgenres and offshoots that I really had to speak on them, especially in the second half of this year. A few critically acclaimed EPs might have primed the pump, but this was the chaotic and noisy breakthrough that many people have hailed today as their best work. And yet with every listen I gave to Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, I found myself a little bit baffled at that. I mean, I understand that in the era of digital distribution, it's much easier to sketch out contemporaries and draw comparisons within a genre, because going back to the early 1980s, the internet sure as hell was not a thing for punks scattered around the world, and punk zines, they only had so much reach, which meant that isolated subcultures of subcultures would germinate in their own isolated space. Hell, even critics of the time would not always get underground tapes that the band originated on the other side of the world, even if the record would retroactively wind up notching a lot of critical acclaim. A lot of critics based in the United States were not hearing UK underground acts. And what I'm trying to say is that with every listen I gave this debut album, the more I was convinced that Discharge, and this record specifically, falls into the category of acts that might have pioneered a specific sound or style, but were not exactly the best to deliver it, even in that time. In other words, this might be the rare Resonators record where I'm less than impressed with the classic record I'm covering. I certainly respect a lot of the influence, but the album didn't quite click on its own for me. And what's a little bit exasperating is that I fully know the things I'm about to criticize are what many Discharge fans have excused or even praised for decades. Yes, the bass is muddy and barely distinct within the mix, and the D-beat drum pattern doesn't quite excuse how sloppy some of the percussion can feel. But that doesn't matter, because those walls of noisy guitar and the bellicose vocals from Cal Morris, they more than compensate, all punched up with production work from Clay Stone, and besides, it's supposed to sound crude and primitive and riotous, raw energy and firepower compensating for any refinement across the board. Hell, that is the appeal of punk music after all. So what if you break down the chord structures of the songs, they can start to feel alarmingly basic, often using minimalist progressions that will inevitably repeat themselves song over song, to the point where individual tracks will blur together in the seething cacophony of sound and noise. Music that's designed to feel like a blunt punch to the face, it doesn't need complexity or insane solos. Just get in the damn pit and rock the fuck out already, come on! And sure, on some level, that's all true. For certain brands of punk, it just needs to be aggressive, belligerent, and really catchy. And that's where I feel that Discharge might stumble a little bit right out of the gate. Critics of the time savaged Discharge for how their guitar mixing could sound like an inarticulate wall of noise, especially with limited foundations in the bass guitar to add complexity, which would wind up being the biggest hidden weapon that Spot's production work over at SST emphasized for that brand of hardcore punk. And sure, some of this was inevitably coming from critics who did not know how to process the extreme aggression and speeds that would later become adopted by the infant thrash metal scene, to say nothing of grindcore. But I have to wonder that if Discharge was more willing to construct an actual hook or add a broader array of chords to individual compositions, or let a bass line actually cut through once in a while, the dynamics of these songs would have stood out a little bit better, and Discharge critical acclaim wouldn't have wound up so retroactive coming from bands that they just inspired so much. And the proof of this working is that when Discharge does embrace meteor riffs or lets their bass build some muscle, or they actually build a real hook, we get some great songs. From the chugging crunch of Protest and Survive to the howling minor key crunch of Drunk with Power, to even the heavier kick drums trying to punch through Free Speech for the Dumb. Hell, when the sample of the clinical nuclear educational film is cut into cries of help, it deserves to be noted here, if only for breaking up some of that sound, which I'd like to say the guitar solos kind of do, but they're often too much of a blur midway back in the mix to really stick in my memory. I think they're really competent, they sound good, but they don't really stand out in the same way. And yeah, the bass is still barely audible, and the less attention paid to how tempo of the drums are paid, the better. Hell, even the mixing some of these instruments that not the lead guitar can feel really messy and not given the effective bite they could really use in retrospect, but there are individual cuts that could have stood out here just on pure composition alone. But then we have to flip over to the lyrics, and look, I get that Discharge was never known for nuance, and for this brand of hardcore or D-beat, it doesn't exactly need it, and Cal Morris was an imposing enough frontman to make anything he roars sound really intimidating, but it's hard not to see the same apocalyptic obsession that could run really dry and early thrash feel kind of undercooked here, and it starts to feel really one-dimensional the deeper you get. Nuclear annihilation, a neo-fascist state, and hell on earth, they're not just the main topics of conversation, they're pretty much the only topics. And while a band sells the urgency and keeps the language broad enough to avoid tying it to any one event or the time, it's not explicitly tied to the Thatcher administration the same way a lot of anarcho-punk was, it doesn't really stand out beyond a few gory details that would come to be driven into the ground by so many metal bands that would come after, inspired by Discharge. And really, it's not like Discharge is willing to vary their sound to emphasize tension or really give some of these grotesque tableaus some menace and contrast, which the increasingly muddy back half of the album could desperately use in order to make some of these scenes that much more visceral. But here's the thing. I totally get why so many folks consider this a classic album to this day, despite my issues with it. There's a single-minded art to such a relentless formula that lays an effective foundation for everything that's going to spring out of it. And if this album hadn't existed in hardcore punk in the early 80s, somebody would have made it, laying the groundwork for thrash, crust punk, grindcore, and so much more. But when it comes to records that I personally would brand as classics that click for me, a record that only serves as foundation doesn't really get there as much as I might want it to, especially when there are choices that could have been made across the board to further hone the band's fundamental appeal and message. So yes, absolutely a place in hardcore history for Hear Nothing, See Nothing, and Say Nothing by Discharge. And while I personally am giving it an extremely strong 6 out of 10, if you're curious about the origin point of a lot of sounds and styles, it is absolutely worth the listen. Again though, I'm not sure it's for everybody. Maybe more of a footnote in the scene that didn't quite click for me and would go on to a lot better things, but it's still worthwhile all the same. Definitely worth your time. So if you haven't heard it, you want to understand where a lot of this came from, yeah, check this out. Solid stuff. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine how controversial this review is going to be, but hey, that's what the comment section's for. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious where you guys all fall on it. You want to buy the record? Links down in the description below. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting this channel and voting for the next episode of Resonators, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even the top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. You want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Resonators on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.